All right, everyone, welcome back. Shannon Vasconcelos, generally my partner for the listener Q&A, is here today. Hi,
Yeah.
Shannon.
Hi, Beth. How are you?
I'm good. For those of you who are brand new to the show and are thinking, who is this Shannon person who I've never seen before? She's a former financial aid officer at both BU and Tufts. We often do this listener Q&A together. Um, you guys sent us a lot of questions. A lot of times you're submitting them on Facebook and Instagram, and we want to thank you for that. If you ever did want to send in an email address or send in an email, our email address is gettingin.voiceamerica@gmail.com. So sometimes Instagram and Facebook just a little bit easier. You could follow us and
Yeah.
just submit your questions there. But we're going to start with a question for Shannon. And all right, Shannon, this comes to us from Christine, who submitted her question on Instagram.
Yeah.
And woohoo, she asks, if a student has multiple merit offers from schools that are slightly lower selectivity, should those all be submitted if asking for an adjustment? In this year with ongoing virus uncertainty, what is the best time to ask for an adjustment? So, two-part question.
Yeah. In terms of should you submit all of your, if you have multiple merit offers, should you send them all in? There are no hard and fast rules. I would lean towards not doing that. I think it sort of minimizes the what you want to create in the mind of the admissions officer is the gentle threat that you're going to go elsewhere. If you throw at them, every offer under the sun that you have, I think that that's less meaningful than perhaps providing one competing offer that you have that is really tempting. You can, I can sort of equate it to, buying a car and going to a car dealership. If you're looking at, a $40,000 car and you want to get the best price, you don't say to them, look, I could go to Toyota and Honda and Hyundai and Isuzu and Subaru and Chrysler and every dealership under the sun and buy this other car for 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000. When you give them too much, there's nothing for them to work with there. Whereas if you say, hey, I'm looking at a very similar car at the dealership down the street for $500 less, can you beat that? That's something they can work with. And that really creates a legitimate threat that you're going to go down the street. So I think it's sort of the same thing when negotiating a scholarship offer. You don't want to give them too much where it all becomes kind of meaningless. If you have one nice offer from ideally, a similar school or a competitor school, that's the ideal. Sometimes you don't have that and you work with what you have. I think that creates the more legitimate threat that you're going to go elsewhere, take that other school up on their offer, as opposed to just throwing everything at them. I think that that's less meaningful.
Right. And I would think too, if I was, it's human nature, right? If you have five offers and they're all pretty solid, as that sixth college, you might just think, well, they have five offers already to choose from. I'm going to spend my time on this student who seems really interested in us. So
Yes,
that makes
agreed.
sense to me.
Yep.
All right.
Okay, so we got a question for you from Aparna that she submitted through Facebook, and she asks, regarding student research that is published, how do admissions officers assess the credibility of the research? There are so many journals. How does one know which one is credible?
So this is a good question, and I think this raises a larger issue, which is what you can expect admissions officers to actually know. So it really shouldn't surprise you
Yes.
that for most schools, admissions officers don't know what the research journals are. They're not really there to assess necessarily the credibility of the research itself or
Mm-hmm.
even of the journal. What they're
Right.
trying to get at is an understanding of why the student did the research, what was compelling about it, how did they carry themselves while they were doing the research. So there are a few suggestions that I would have here. So throw away focusing on the journals or where they got it published,
Right.
and instead focus on a short abstract, very short, one paragraph that in layman's terms explains what the research was. That can go in the additional information section of the common application, Or if the school doesn't take the common application, it can go in their additional information section, or they may even have a section for, hey, if you did research, give us an overview of what you did. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, this is generally most schools will accept an additional letter of recommendation. We've talked about this before. The goal is not to have 20 additional letters of recommendation, or even, quite honestly, 3 additional letters of recommendation. I have colleagues who will say 2 extra is okay. I personally think 1 extra is your max, and I really encourage not doing more than that. And from my time in admissions, I can tell you that if I had a student who had multiple letters of recommendation, I read them in the order they were in the file, and after 2 or 3, I stopped. Right, so I read the 2 teacher recommendations, and then if they had extras beyond that, I would read 1 of those. And if you submitted 3 and the third was the best one, I wasn't going to read it because I didn't have time, right?
Yeah.
So it is really, really valuable, and I realize I'm getting on a tangent here a little bit, but it's really valuable to edit down to the essential stuff and not just throw everything at the admissions officer and hope that they will look at it all, and because quite honestly they likely are not going to, right? So you don't need to send a copy of the journal. You don't need, maybe you have a link to your research, but maybe you do that on a LinkedIn page that you set up for yourself where you collect all of this information. And then if you have an admissions officer who is interested and has the time to dig in, they can see it, but through that LinkedIn, or if the school provides you an opportunity to provide a link to your larger research. But that small abstract is your friend. And then a letter of recommendation from a person who ideally maybe mentored your research. And the kinds of things that you would look for as an admissions officer are the similar things that you would look for from a recommendation writer, depending on the selectivity of the institution. So if we're talking about some of the most selective schools in the country, we're looking for things like the student is working on par with my college seniors, or I've worked with 200 high school students doing research, and this one stands out particularly because of X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Or we have seen them where in our former lives as admissions officers, where it might have said the only high school student in the state to present his research at our statewide professional conference. So the recommendation writer can provide the context to share with the admissions officer how compelling that research really is. So again, your admissions officer is not going to assess the quality or the way in which you used the scientific process or even the results that you got necessarily. What they are going to be looking for is support that this was a really well done thing, and oftentimes that's going to come from the recommendation writer.
Got it. And I know that you and the other admissions folks on our team have talked about the length of time you had to read an application. And I think parents might be shocked at how short a time is. So you really have to cut to the chase, and less is more.
Yes, less is almost always more. There are a few exceptions, but usually that's like a homeschooled student or a student with a lot to explain. Even then, less is more. You want to get it down to the key elements that the admissions officer really needs to see. All right. Next question comes to us from Natalie. Natalie says, my daughter will be applying to some local schools so we can save on room and board. We will likely not qualify for much need-based aid, so we're striving for merit by applying to schools where she will be above average for typical admitted students. This all sounds great right now, right? My question is whether or not she should state she is seeking on campus when applying to the schools and financial aid forms, or state off campus with family. My concern is that the schools will offer less merit if they know she will commute rather than live on campus. Interesting.
Yeah, so I think my short answer to your question is simply to be honest. If you know for sure that she is going to live at home, then you should say that on the application. If you think that there is some possibility, maybe depending on financial aid or scholarships, that she will live on campus, then that's what I would say. I would go for the highest cost possibility that is actually a possibility for you. Because what will happen is the I know you're thinking mostly about merit. You say you might qualify for some, but not much need-based aid. In the need-based financial aid awarding process, they're going to award her based on what you report, um, the living arrangement that you report. And you will qualify for less need-based financial aid if that living arrangement is living at home. Essentially, there are budgets set up for students living on campus, off campus in their own apartment, and then living at home. And the cost of attendance of the school that the financial aid office is using when determining financial aid eligibility is lowest for those students who are living at home, meaning you naturally qualify for less financial aid because your costs are lower. So if you thought that there was some possibility of her living on campus, I'd recommend indicating that to start. They will award you then financial aid based upon that higher on-campus budget. But here's the thing, if you then decide to live at home, because of course you have to notify the school you're going to live at home rather than in the dorms. They need to know that information to figure out who's living in what dorm room. Once you let them know that you are living at home, if you had initially indicated that you'd be living on campus, were awarded financial aid based on that budget. Once you tell them you're living at home, they adjust your financial aid to account for that. So eventually your financial aid is going to be based on whatever you actually end up doing. I would recommend, again, if there's any question in your mind at this point, going with the higher cost on campus arrangement to start, simply because that will likely get you the most potential for financial aid to start. And if you kind of did it in reverse, if you said you were living at home, were awarded a small financial aid package to start, then decided to live on campus later, the school might have already run out of financial aid funding at that point. And even though you'd be eligible for more aid, they wouldn't have the money to give you. So I would err on the side of caution, assuming the higher cost living arrangement to start. But again, only if it's a real possibility. There's no use telling them on campus getting more financial aid for that when they are eventually going to reduce it anyway if you live off campus. And all that really relates to the need-based financial aid. In terms of merit scholarships, I would say a school will typically not award you less merit scholarships if you're living at home rather than living on campus. The merit scholarships usually do not relate to your on-campus or off-campus living arrangements. I would say sometimes maybe like the biggest, most prestigious scholarships that a school offers might have an on-campus living requirement, like big old full scholarship that covers tuition and room and board. You might have to live on campus to keep that room and board portion. Sometimes, not always, some schools will allow you to carry that excess funding, on an off-campus living arrangement. A smaller, kind of more typical merit scholarships, it might be, for $5,000 here or $1,000 there, typically don't have any kind of on-campus living requirement. So I would say in general, it doesn't really make a difference for merit scholarships most of the time. And again, if you said you were living on campus in order to go for that big, giant, full boat merit scholarship, and then you tell them you're moving off campus, well, then they'll adjust things later. So it will eventually catch up with you. Be honest, but if you're not quite sure yet, go with the higher cost living arrangement, I'd say.
Well, and if you got one of those big giant packages that are so rumored, but there really aren't that many of those. But if you did, maybe that would be the ideal because perhaps your daughter wants to live on campus. And so then that would make that possible.
Right.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question before we go to break.
Okay, Lisa asks, I know that the College Board is eliminating subject tests and the writing section of the SAT, but what if some schools still require them and I don't have them? Should my student try to take the subject tests in May and June just in case?
The answer here is no, because your student cannot, unless they are international. And so, for starters, no colleges are going to require them because they literally do not exist after today, after the College Board made that announcement the other day. They are allowing them for international students only in May and June, and then they are done. So if you are an American-based family, if your student had registered for them in May and June, they were unregistered, unceremoniously dumped, shall we say, from taking those subject
Right.
tests. So it is literally not a question of whether you should or should not take them. You literally cannot take them. If you have scores already, then the individual schools will set a policy, and it's certainly possible that they will consider them if you want to submit them. I would say that most students won't have them already who are currently juniors, but there are some. I have worked with students who sometimes do a subject test at the end of 10th grade or sometimes even at the end of 9th grade. But for the most part, most students don't have them. You will not be penalized for not having them. The only thing that they could do is potentially add if that's a school that's willing to still look at them, but you have no choices to make. These are done. All right, well, with that, I rarely do I get to give such an easy answer.
I know, easy short answer. I love it.
Short answer. All right, with that, we are going to take a very quick break, and when we come back, we're just going to basically keep doing more of the same, and so we'll be back in just a couple of minutes.